If we want to say the coffee was hot in Spanish, we can either say el café estaba caliente or el café estuvo caliente. Now, both are correct, but there's a subtle difference. In English, it's just one sentence, but in Spanish, we're using two different past tenses, the imperfect tense and the preterite tense. Now, this is exactly why using estar in the past can feel confusing at first. Spanish has two different past tenses for this verb, and deciding which one to use is the trickiest parts for learners. So in this video, my goal is to make everything click. By the end, you'll always know which tense to use when talking about estar in the past. So here's what I'm going to do. First, I'll break down the imperfect tense to see when and why we use it. Then I'll do the same for the preterite tense. Finally, we'll revisit our opening example and I'll show you how the context decides which one is correct. Now, before I show you some example sentences using estar in the imperfect tense, let me show you the conjugations for estar in the imperfect tense. So we have I was, yo estaba. You were, tú estabas. He or she was, él o ella estaba. We were, nosotros estábamos. You all were, vosotros estabais. They were, ellos estaban. Let's start by looking at how the imperfect tense works. We use the imperfect to first of all set the scene, giving the background or context of a situation. Secondly, we use it to describe how things used to be, explaining what people, places, or things were like in the past. Thirdly, it's used for things we did on a regular basis, actions that happened repeatedly over time. Fourthly, the imperfect applies when there is no specific time frame, meaning the action doesn't have a clear beginning or end. And finally, we use it for moments with interrupted actions, where an ongoing action in the imperfect tense is interrupted by an event in the preterite tense. Okay, so let's break these 5 uses down. So for the first use, if we were setting the scene, we could say, the house was quiet. La casa estaba tranquila. This is setting the scene because we're describing the background, how things were at that moment, not a single completed action. Or we could say, the garden was beautiful. El jardín estaba bonito. Here we're setting the scene by describing the general state of the garden, giving context for what's happening rather than a specific event. Okay, so for the second use, if we were describing how things used to be, we could say, I was happy at school. Yo estaba feliz en la escuela. So we use the imperfect tense because it describes a general, ongoing state during my time at school, not a single one-time event. Or we could say, she was always tired after work. Ella estaba siempre cansada después del trabajo. Here the imperfect tense shows an ongoing condition in the past, not something that happened just once. Okay, so thirdly, if we were describing things we did on a regular basis, we could say, we were always together on weekends. Siempre estábamos juntos los fines de semana. Here we use the imperfect because this was a repeated habit, something that happened regularly, not just once. Or we could say, every summer I was at the beach. Cada verano estaba en la playa. The imperfect tense is used here to show a recurring action over time, not a single completed event. Now, fourthly, if we were describing things with no specific time frame, we could say, we were in the park while we were playing with the dogs. Nosotros estábamos en el parque mientras jugábamos con los perros. We use the imperfect tense here because the sentence doesn't give a specific start or end time. It just describes what was happening in general. Or another sentence we could say, I was always with my mum when we would go to see my uncle. Siempre estaba con mi mamá cuando íbamos a ver a mi tío. The imperfect tense is used here because there's no specific start or end time. Siempre estaba con mi mamá describes a repeated state. It gives general background information rather than a single completed event. Okay, finally, if we want to describe moments with interrupted actions, we could say, the sky was cloudy when the sun came out. El cielo estaba nublado cuando salió el sol. We use the imperfect estaba nublado to describe the ongoing background state and the preterite salió for events that interrupt it. Or another example, we could say the restaurant was empty when Maria and her family arrived. El restaurante está vacío cuando llegó María y su familia. The imperfect estaba vacío sets the scene, and the preterite llegó shows the action that interrupts that state. So the imperfect tense sets the scene and describes the background in the past, showing ongoing conditions, repeated habits, or general states without a clear beginning or end. If you look back at the examples, you'll see how one sentence can contain elements of multiple categories. Background information, ongoing situations, and habitual actions often appear together. These uses overlap, which is why the imperfect tense can describe more than one idea at a time. And sometimes the imperfect can be paired with the preterite, which marks a specific event that interrupts or occurs within that ongoing background. But to sum it all up, the key takeaway is that the imperfect tense shows what was happening over time. Now, if you want a handy reference for everything we're covering in this video, I've made a free PDF that you can download. It's perfect for reviewing later at your own pace. You'll find the link down in the description below. Okay, so now that we've analysed estar in the imperfect tense, let's take a look at estar in the preterite tense. Now, before I show you some example sentences, let me show you the conjugations for estar in the preterite tense. So we have I was, yo estuve. You were, tú estuviste. He or she was, él o ella estuvo. We were, nosotros estuvimos. You all were, vosotros estuvisteis. They were, ellos estuvieron. Okay, so let's now look at how the preterite tense works. We use estar in the preterite to describe completed actions in the past, which generally fall into two categories. One, a specific event, or two, a specific time frame. A specific event is something that happened once and is completed, while a specific time frame has a clear beginning and end. The preterite is also often used to narrate a sequence of events, linking several completed actions in order to tell the story of what happened. So if we were describing a specific event, we could say, I was at Anna's party. Estuve en la fiesta de Ana. Or, we were at the work meeting. Estuvimos en la reunión de trabajo. Those two sentences use the preterite tense because they focus on a single completed event, something that happened once at a specific moment. There's no ongoing action, no background context, and no repeated activity. Each one is a one-time finished event, which is why the preterite is used. Now, if we were describing a specific time frame, we could say, I was in Madrid last month. Estuve en Madrid el mes pasado. Or, they were at the beach all afternoon. Estuvieron en la playa durante toda la tarde. Those two sentences use the preterite because they describe a state that lasted over a clearly defined period of time, in this case a month and an afternoon. Therefore, there is a definite beginning and end. This isn't background information, it's the main point being communicated. Because the time frame has a clear start and end, Spanish treats it as a completed event, so we use the preterite. Having said that, it's important to note that the preterite doesn't have to refer to a single one-time event. It can also describe something that happened multiple times, as long as each occurrence is clearly bounded in time. For example, we could say, I was in Madrid in January, April and August in 2018. Estuve en Madrid en enero, abril y agosto de 2018. This shows that I was in Madrid on 3 separate occasions. Each visit is completed and tied to a specific time, and it's bounded in time because I specify that it took place in 2018. So even though it happened more than once, the preterite is still used because the events are clearly defined and completed. Now there's one more important use of the preterite that I need to mention, and that's when we describe a sequence of events where one completed action follows another. This is different from a single event or a defined time frame because here we're telling a story, listing what happened step by step. Each action is finished before the next one begins, so we use the preterite for all of them. For example, we could say, I was in the office, then I was in the meeting, and finally I was in the restaurant before going home. And in Spanish that would be, estuve en la oficina, después estuve en la reunión, y finalmente estuve en el restaurante antes de volver a casa. Now, each use of estuve describes a completed action in the past. The focus is on the order of events, moving the narrative forward. This is a common use of the preterite when you want to tell what happened step by step. Now, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned how the sentence, the coffee was hot, can be translated in Spanish in 2 ways. One using the imperfect tense and one using the preterite tense. So what's going on here? How can both be correct? Well, let's break it down. At first glance, the sentence, the coffee was hot, seems simple, but in Spanish it can mean 2 very different things depending on the story or context. And here's the tricky part. With just a single sentence, you can't tell whether to use the imperfect or the preterite. The key is context. What's happening around that moment or what comes next in the story. As we go through these examples, try to imagine the scene or think about what someone might say next. This will help you see whether the sentence is describing background information, which uses the imperfect, or the focus of the story, which uses the preterite. So here's a reminder of the 2 sentences. In the imperfect tense, the sentence is El café estaba caliente. And in the preterite tense, the sentence is El café estuvo caliente. Now, when you use estaba, you're not talking about one specific moment. You're just describing how things were in the background. It's a bit like painting a picture. You're setting the scene so the listener can imagine the moment. You're saying, at that time, in that situation, the coffee was hot. Nothing is starting or ending. Nothing is happening as an event. You're simply giving context, the same way you might say that the sun was shining or that the house was quiet. These aren't actions, they're conditions. They tell us what the world looked like while something else was happening. So estaba is used when the temperature of the coffee is just part of the background, not the main thing you're trying to tell. On the other hand, when you use estuvo, you're not describing the background anymore. You're talking about one specific moment in time. You're treating the coffee being hot as something that happened during a clearly defined event. It's like saying the coffee was hot at that exact time. There's a built-in beginning and end. Maybe you don't say them out loud, but they're understood. You're thinking of that heat as something that happened during that moment and is now finished. For example, the next day, if you were telling someone about that one specific cup of coffee that was hot, you'd naturally use the preterite, el café estuvo caliente. And you'd use the preterite because you're looking back at that one event, that one cup of coffee at that moment when it was hot. So the difference is simple. The imperfect estaba is used when the information is background. It describes how things were around the action, like part of the scene. And the preterite estuvo is used when that detail becomes the focus of the story. You're talking about what happened in one specific moment or event. Now, even after watching this video, you still might feel a bit unsure when to use estaba and when to use estuvo, and that's completely normal. The key is to practice these forms in real sentences so you can use them naturally and confidently when speaking. That's exactly what my beginner Spanish course helps you to do. It guides you step by step to build sentences from the very first lesson, using verbs like estar in context. You can check out my course for free right here on YouTube by clicking the thumbnail that's on screen now, or by following the link in the description. So, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.